Welcome everyone to another training video, and this coming Tuesday will be the final session. I think this is officially number 12, but on YouTube it'll be known as session number 11 based on the number of videos that I have on this. There's also an easy week in there, that's why it's 11 instead of 12. But regardless, we'll talk through a little bit more, and I want to elaborate on a couple of things that I've at least learned from my previous video on the ramp test, and so this can serve more or less as an update and a recap of some of the items on there. And so what I'd like to go through is some of the pros and the cons of the ramp test that's in Zwift, and a few tips as well to get the most out of your ramp tests, whether you use them to go and estimate your FTP, or if you go and wanted to use it as just a training session, which there are some pros that do ramp tests just for training to get them to hit their max from a heart rate as well as a power perspective. So what I wanted to do was outline a couple of pros and cons, and feel free to comment below in terms of your thoughts on some additional pros and cons are. These are just some of the ones that stick out, at least to me. And so one of the first pros that I see here is that the ramp tests are really good at measuring your heart rate. So max HR is definitely something that is very achievable to get on a ramp test. And part of the reason why is to the second part is that it's relatively safe in terms from an injury standpoint to go on a max effort. Compare this to, say, a ramp test that would be part of running, where you could probably have some running injuries. And for swimming, of course, it's really hard to measure accurate heart rate in the water. So from an injury standpoint, ramp tests, at least on the bike, are pretty nice to have. So injury is definitely something that a ramp test here on a bike is not very likely. The other part that I really like about ramp tests is that they're very repeatable. And repeatability is essential when it comes to understanding what are your improvements that you want to make. Let me finish writing this here. And it's very important to know what you can repeat and what you can measure on so that you can measure improvements. And because of that, the reason why they're relatively repeatable is because they are shorter in duration. So the duration of a good ramp test usually is under half an hour. And so the hard stuff is going to be done within that half-hour period. Maybe a little bit longer for those that are a little bit more fit, and at least for the Zwift ramp test, it's usually pretty short and sweet, but very painful. There's no such thing as no pain in a ramp test. So you will be going at a max effort, especially towards the end. But that's not to say that everything in the Zwift ramp test, or in ramp tests in general, they're not always going to be the best thing. One is that in terms of FTPs are not necessarily, the ramp test is not the most accurate. And the reason for this is because the way how a ramp test is calculating your FTP is basically it goes to your max, and it'll essentially only take about 75 to 80% of your max 1 minute power. Which, for those that can put out super big bursts of power, that can probably overinflate your FTP a little bit. But likewise, too, is if you don't really have a very good set of legs that can crank out VO2 max, and it's possible where your VO2 max may be low, but you may have a really good base. And so it may be underestimating your FTP in that manner. And so, again, it is more or less an estimate, and I'll get to the tips on that in a little bit here. Now, another con is that you may require calibration. And by this, this is especially something with non-drivetrain smart trainers. So I have a wheel-on trainer, so there may be times where sometimes I'll have to calibrate that power trainer to make sure that I'm getting the right output, especially if you're using different tires. And I had a little bit of an incident a few weeks ago that kind of really put that to the spotlight, where when I switched tires, I went to like 20 watts of difference, and then I had to go and recalibrate it, and even then it was still quite off. So there may be some calibration that's needed. Another thing is erg mode. Here for ramp test, ramp tests are unique in that erg mode actually is a little bit better on if you have it on during a ramp test. And the reason for that is that you continue to pedal at your particular cadence, and erg mode will automatically adjust the amount of power. But if you don't have a smart trainer, then you'll have to manually go and shift gears. And sometimes the smart trainers may or may not be able to produce the amount of resistance that's needed to match the amount of power that is on the output. And so, because it goes every minute, and sometimes it takes like 20 seconds to really dial into that power, and so it can adjust. Or at least there may be some fluctuations, and so it may not be the most accurate way of measuring power. And because of that, power measurement is not the most accurate, then it could influence your FTP results as it comes to the ramp test. And lastly is the intervals for these ramp tests. So there are two versions. So something I want to clarify here is the original or the standard ramp test goes up by 20 watts. And generally, if you are less than 60 kilos, or you have an FTP, which I think translates to about 120, 130 watts, don't do the standard test. There is a ramp test light version, which is for those riders who are about 60 to 65 kilograms or less, or if your FTP is under like 150, generally. You can try to go on the regular, but believe me, go on the light. If you're less experienced, or if your weight is under 65, I think it's 60 kilograms, and I'm going to pull this up here. The ramp test light is ideally if you are below 60 kilos, or 132 pounds, depending on freedom units. If you're under that, then do go with the light version as opposed to the regular. Or the regular version, you're going to burn up once you hit 180, 200 watts. And that's never fun. We had a few folks that did that on the last ride. But for that, back to intervals. So the intervals of what happens in the Zwift ramp test is it goes up by 20 watts for the standard and 10 watts by the light. That's not necessarily the most scientific or the best intervals. And these intervals can change around depending on what program you're using. So, and what I mean by that is Zwift does 10 or 20 watts difference. But if you go by Trainer Road, they have a more normalized pattern. Sometimes it only go up by 8, sometimes it'll go up by 15. But basically, how Trainer Road does it is that essentially once you hit the 24-minute mark of that test, you should be at your maximum power. And then it calculates your FTP on that. But for Zwift, you may be going on even longer. And because you are going longer than that time, just to even get to your FTP, for some folks that are really strong, that can provide some unintended bias to the measurement. So the interval of power is not necessarily going to be the most accurate for everybody. So do keep that in mind, especially if your FTP, as you start going later into the ramp test, when, especially if you're going past around like 25 minutes. Something to think about. Now, a couple of tips that I'd like to share. Erg mode is definitely a little bit easier when you do a ramp test in Zwift because you don't have to switch gears. But do be warned that if you do decide to go and switch gears, or actually not switch gears, but if you do decide to drop your cadence, it starts getting really hard and you're going to really start to mash your pedals. So when you do the ramp test, try to make sure that you maintain a consistent RPM throughout. Your trainer, your smart trainer, will automatically adjust the amount of resistance to match the number that you need to hit, but really make sure that you keep that cadence or you're going to go into that grind and it's not going to be fun and you won't get the result that you're really looking for. So that's my first tip with erg mode. Second is fluids. Make sure to take fluids throughout, but once the going gets really hard, then I suggest that you don't take fluids, mainly because, well, your body won't really accept any. But it's very important to take fluids early on, especially before you hit your FTP. I found that helps to go beyond FTP, because once you go beyond FTP, usually it's about 6 to 7 minutes more of pain. And usually you may be able to take one batch of fluids in there, but generally it's, at least from my experience, that hasn't always worked out to be the best. And then the third is FTP. As I've mentioned, the Zwift ramp test is a estimate. It's not meant to be scientifically exact. And again, it may not necessarily be the FTP result that you're looking for. There's a lot of different variables that go into this. For example, you may not be fully recovered. I know I personally won't be when I go and record and publish this video doing the ramp test 2 days later. I know I'm not fully recovered because I just finished a 3-hour ride earlier today on a trainer. Not the best thing to do right before a ramp test. So ideally, when you do ramp test, you want to come in fully rested, but it may not necessarily be the case for some folks. It can also vary on the amount of sleep that you're going to get. It can also vary on kind of what your mood is, what amount of caffeine that you've taken in. So again, there's going to be a lot of variability, and that's what this symbol is here, sigma, for those that are not as scientific. So there's going to be a lot of variability when it comes to these tests, or with any test in the matter of fact. So don't feel that that's the end game. You can always do is rest for a few days and then do the ramp test again and see if you get a better result or something that you think is more representative. So again, the best part of this is that it's repeatable, and that if you don't feel that you're getting the number that you really should be, or that you feel that you should be getting, it's okay to take it again. And the repeatability part, let the data go and speak for where you are at. And that went a little bit longer than I anticipated, but I hope this helps to clarify a couple things as it relates to the ramp test. And that stated, make sure that you do select the ramp test according to what your FTP is or to your weight category. The regular ramp test is for those that are greater than 60 kilos and roughly, and I say roughly, have an FTP. If you are less than 60 kilos or 132 pounds, probably take the ramp test light, or if your FTP is just under 150 watts. That's my recommendation, but you are more than free to choose the regular ramp test if you want to, but the regular ramp test might be very steep for those that are in the lighter category or are relatively new to cycling. That stated, that's what I have here, and hopefully you enjoyed this summary. And please give this video a like if you do like this summary, and go and hit the subscribe button if you went ahead and like the content of these videos, and be sure to hit that bell notification as well to get the latest and greatest from the videos that I do upload hopefully every week. And with that, I'll hopefully see you Zwifting.